So the topic of cyber risk quantification and why is it important today? I think this group at least doesn't need to be told of why this is important. But the challenge that we face today, and I've interacted with some of you here, some of you, in different environments, different areas. Deloitte has globally polled about 1,000 plus cybersecurity executives across the globe in 20 plus countries. Everybody had one thing to say in common. A lot of them indicated that yes, about 58% indicated that they were planning to increase their investments. So what about the remaining 42% of executives? Are they not increasing their investments? No, it's not that. I'm sure there's a segment of executives who've been constantly regularly, periodically investing in enhancing their cybersecurity capabilities, and hence don't need to suddenly increase their investments. But we still see a lot of executives struggling with convincing their businesses on why investments are important. And that's the conversation we're here to simplify, actually, because you and I understand this. You and I speak the language of risk, and hence we understand why this is important. But then to speak the language that the business executives understand, to speak the language that your major stakeholders with whom you're dealing with understand, is definitely a different skill altogether. Somewhere I would say this conversation also reminds me of a trend that we saw about a decade ago, 10 to 15 years ago, when the conversation had become all about the business value of IT, business value of technology. And overnight, CIOs were expected to justify their investments in spending technology in terms of telling businesses how investments in technology can help their businesses become better, do business better. An investment in a technology can help drive revenue, drive profitability, etc. And the CISOs, a lot of CISOs obviously were not equipped for it because they were predominantly people who built systems, operated systems, etc. And they had to learn that language of being able to say how technology can help businesses. This conversation is similar yet very different, because 10, 15 years ago we told the businesses, technology is the way, and today they are on board with us on that. And today we're standing there with the same executives and telling them that, we've invested in all this technology, now there is risk in this technology, in using this, and we have to spend even more because there is a risk of using technology. So yes, it is a different scenario altogether, because the language here is not just business. The additional language that we need to speak is that of risk. Again, a not consistently understood language and a not consistently used language as well across enterprises. So you have the business language to speak, you have the risk language to speak, and that is where this whole topic of how do we communicate with the business executives comes into play. Now, that's not the only difference, actually. The other difference is that when we spoke about the business value of technology, the audience was just the internal organization, your business executives. Today, when we speak about the risk, the cyber risks, the quantification, the financial impact of cyber risks, the audience is not just your internal organization. It's not just your business executives, not just the board. In organizations across the globe where they're already seeing a significant number of regulations, penalties, etc., this language needs to be spoken to the government, to federal agencies, to insurers, your shareholders, everyone actually. And when the data protection bill in India also sees the light of the day, that will be the scenario in India as well. So it's just a matter of time when this conversation is something that you and I will start having with every one of our stakeholders, internal and external. And that is why this is important. So my journey of learning and the experience of cyber risk quantification started from my previous job. I joined Deloitte quite recently, about 6 months ago. Before that, I was part of one of the largest oil and gas energy companies in the world. And I was heading up quite a few of the cybersecurity capabilities. the conversation and our cybersecurity capabilities were very mature, I would say, and we used to take pride in it until we had a latest edition of a board member who came from a risk background and started asking us questions on, how prepared are we for cyber attacks? How do we know that our organization is really secure? Is it just by luck that we haven't had a cyber attack? So we had a board member of one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world asking these questions to us. We were actually very happy initially because we started getting attention from the board. But then as we started developing those quarterly reports, that is when we realized that talking to the board, communicating to the board was no easy job, despite the fact that we all internally felt that we were very mature, we were very secure, and we took pride in the capabilities we had. But telling that to the board in a language they understood was not an easy task. And we also realized, and that's when I appreciated the value of having the right set of KPIs. We had KPIs, but very internal ones. We used to measure response times, vulnerabilities, some basic cyber hygiene metrics. That was not enough to tell a very powerful story to the board. And also to tell them, that where we are doing things right, where we need their help in doing some things better as well. That is where, I started working on identifying how do I quantify risks, how do I get the right set of metrics in place, how do I get visibility, in, how do I get those dashboards and everything. And my learnings, it is very complex. It takes a lot of effort, especially the initial setup of doing that whole activity. Even if you have a lot of the core foundational capabilities in place, just getting to the point where you have a very structured framework, an approach that helps you, identify your various risk scenarios, be able to, measure how effectively your controls work, your mitigations work, be able to say that, what could be the financial impact of not mitigating the risk, etc., is a pretty complex exercise, does take in a lot of time and effort, and has various other challenges because you gather data from different data sources, technical challenges. You need a single platform, you need an integrator, etc. So yes, there is complexity in doing it, but trust me, it was worthwhile doing all of it because our journey from there on became a lot more smoother, at least in getting the right kind of investments and support from very senior executives in the firm. Now, talking about cyber risk quantification. So we are risk professionals over here, security professionals over here. We understand the simple math. Risk comes when there is a threat and there's a presence of vulnerabilities. So threat meets vulnerabilities, there is a risk of something going wrong there. And how do you quantify the financial impact? Multiply the financial impact with threat into vulnerability and you get, the financial impact of a risk. That's the theoretical equation. Sounds very simple. And I'm sure all of you sitting here knows how to identify your threats, how to identify your vulnerabilities, how to prioritize which threats are most relevant to your organization, which vulnerabilities are most critical to your organization. So we're all experts in doing that. Then let's understand the other part, the financial impact. So what goes into calculating the financial impact of a risk? And this is where I'd like to introduce you to the Deloitte's iceberg. So the common factors, cost factors that we are all aware of a cyber risk, or even if I put it as a cyber attack, is the cost of conducting technical investigations, the cost of recovery, the cost of associated PR activities. If you're a consumer-facing organization, the cost of dealing with all the communications with your consumers, litigation costs, and obviously, whenever there is an incident, there's always a post-incident evaluation, follow-up required to drive improvements, etc., to tell people that you've learned a lesson. So that cost is also part of the known cost. And we call them above the surface costs. Now let's see what falls beneath the surface costs now. Because you have to deal with cyber attacks, that eventually when you're dealing with cyber attacks, you're going to pay penalties, especially if you're a regulated company. And in order to mitigate that, you're going to take a cyber insurance. So yes, your money may be recovered, but don't forget that you're also paying a premium. to maintain that cyber insurance. So that's your hidden cost. The cost of premium, the increased cost to raise debt. That is if you're, in the light of a cyber attack, it could be possible you lose reputation in the market, you lose customers in the market, your organization's credit rating will get affected by it. And when all that happens, yes, the organization suffers that additional cost of raising a debt when they are in the market as well. Those are the business value of the, of the cost associated with cyber risks. An impact of operational disruption, yes, if your systems are not available, if your banks, you cannot transact, if you're running manufacturing operations, you cannot, produce things. So yes, there is an operational disruption and the cost of that. Then there's a lost value of through customer relationships, you lose trust, you lose business, value of lost contract revenue, devaluation of a trade, your stock share prices, devaluation of share prices. Imagine the amount of cost that you have never thought about, which actually is going to happen when you have a real cyber attack, and especially if that attack has a far-reaching impact on your consumers, customers, etc. So those are the factors, and yes, if you run any critical infrastructure for the country, you're also impacting the country's national security as well. Those are the factors we call beneath the surface, and the more difficult ones to calculate as well. So when we thought of the format initially of the workshop, we wanted it to be an interactive one where we also get a little hands-on, but because of the limitation in time and also some logistical things, we didn't do that. But we're certainly happy to do that with you. If you're interested, you can reach out to us as well. Now, when calculating, there are many methodologies, I would say, available, known to us. Some of these methodologies that you already may be familiar with, a Monte Carlo. We have products in the market as well, where they have used some of these underlying frameworks, methodologies, and have come up with, a way to calculate quantify cyber risks. At Deloitte, we use a combination of both. We use our own framework, and we have our tools as well that sort of helps calculate this, and at the same time, we also partner with third parties, and I'll tell you the reason why as well sometimes. So when you look at a scenario, I won't go deeper into this in the interest of time, but then this is something that all of us here are familiar with. When we develop a risk scenario, and this is a real case study that we've done for a global technology company that's a supplier of both hardware and software services. And because they're a supplier of hardware and software services, one of their biggest risk scenarios is a supply chain disruption caused by a cyber attack on probably one of their supply chain partners. So when we look at a scenario like this, there is definitely a threat actor associated. A potential scenario starts with definitely reconnaissance, and through reconnaissance, gaining an initial entry into the third party's network. They could steal, cause damage on that network itself, or if the third party has interfaces into your company, it can move laterally and get into your company environment and then cause further damage. So that's a typical scenario that we take into account. And the risk driver here is lack of controls or adequate visibility on your third party's risk management, which is a common issue faced by most enterprises. I've been on the other side as well. The only kind of cyber incidents I had dealt with is associated with our third parties in our supply chain, because we literally had limited and to no control on how third parties manage their risk. And a disruption in supply chain of key components, etc. So that's a risk. And then you identified the above the surface and beneath the surface factors as well. Now this is this is where the complexity builds in when you want to calculate the financial impact of the various factors. You have above the surface, beneath the surface. A lot of the above the surface factors, you can still derive it on your own because they are, they are a fixed formula, numerator, denominator, you get something. But let's look at some of the, beneath the surface factors. At the bottom table, brand damage, loss of assets, revenue, cyber insurance premiums, cybersecurity improvements, public relation costs, etc. Yes. And the only way to quantify costs there is through empirical models or analytical models. In very simple terms, empirical models are the ones derived. You use a statistical model there. You derive it by putting in some data first, making assumptions using linear regression models or statistical models, and then derive a value there. Analytical models are more equation driven. So some of it requires a lot of input parameters, uses a probable algorithm or an equation, and then derive it. This is where the complexity comes in, that when you have to deal with it yourselves actually, which is where, and obviously identifying, the likelihood factors, etc. Which is where, we do recommend you use, one, definitely the right competence and skills of people who can help you do this, but also the right set of tools as well. Now, the journey towards building a good cyber risk quantification is not a one-stop thing actually. It's not like you start doing this and you get done with it. It is a journey, and there are many steps that you could take in this journey. And you don't have to get to straight doing the financial impact calculation. You can start with, first defining the cyber risk appetite. For those organizations with probably, who are not yet fully mature in their cybersecurity capabilities, I would say start with defining your cyber risk appetite. Do a threat assessment for your organization, identify your threats, vulnerabilities, how they impact your organization, map the mitigating controls you have in place, and have the right KPIs to measure the effectiveness of such controls as well. Now, this is the first step, and this is something that I think some of your organizations already have in place as well. And if you have this, good, because then you can go to the next step. And you've seen the complexity of this, and imagine having to talk about this with your business executives, with your board, with your shareholders. It is a difficult conversation, and our suggestion is often for you to run it as a program, to get the right governance, right stakeholders, right buy-in, etc., to drive this. Then identify your above the surface, beneath the surface factors. If you can calculate them on your own, good. If you feel they're too complex and you need more expertise, then get in the right expertise, and you'll definitely see more value out of this. So yes, this is my last slide. I did want to leave some room for Q&A, but I think we're running out of time. So, okay, yeah, sure, one question. Anybody, any questions?
Joyce, would we be able to use cyber risk quantification to show returns to our CFO, right? Because every time we go to our CFO, you get the budget, but then the question comes, okay, how are you spending it and what's the return, right? And we can use a risk modeling for that.
Yes, indeed.
Does this help?
We can, because what this model does is, say for example, it uses all the different parameters to calculate and say that's the total loss, that's of this particular risk. That's the total, value, business value of the risk. The way the model works is, if it says that if this is the case, you're mapping your mitigating controls there. So if you manage them better by adding your capabilities, saying, okay, you don't have a proper AppSec tools here, you invest in them, it reduces your risk and reduces that risk in terms of your dollar value also, your rupee value as well. So yes, the model actually helps in telling you that, the investments can help reduce the amount of loss that you can incur in case of a cyber attack. It does help with that, indeed.
Just one question.
Yes.
The cyber threats themselves are very dynamic. So how agile is this model, or how much time before this gets outdated?
So there are two ways of looking at it. You're completely right. The threat landscape is an ever-evolving one. So there is a one-time assessment that you would do to identify your threats, to identify the impact of those threats, to give them a particular rating as to weightage and everything. But then if you use a product, all this is there in the background actually. So in terms of its calculations, it's not a fixed input. The input can change as well, and with the change in input, that mapping remains consistent or can be added and removed as well. Your threats, mitigating controls, vulnerabilities, mitigating controls. So if you're changing that, then your calculation changes depending on what input parameters you put in. So a lot of the tools, and including ours in Deloitte, are built that way for you to constantly keep it updated with the latest input. whether it's your threat, changing vulnerabilities, etc. Yes, indeed. The organizers will be sharing it, this version, yes. And we are also available at booth number 13. In case you want to ask any more questions, please feel free to visit us. All right, thank you everyone. Have a good evening and a great SecuFest.